Now, one characteristic of Hegel's thought, which you've made very clear, is that he always sees ideas not just as existing in the abstract, and certainly not being timeless and unchanging in the way that, say, Plato saw them, but as being embodied in societies and institutions and historical realities which change. Now, given that fact, what sort of society does Hegel see this whole process as culminating in? What sort of society is it leading towards?
Well, as you'd expect from what we've been saying, it's a rational society, a rationally ordered society. But I must make clear what that is for Hegel, because it's not the society of pure reason. Hegel saw the society of pure reason as typified by the kind of thing that the French revolutionaries wanted to do. You know, they didn't just get rid of the king and the nobles and of religion, but they tried to make everything rational. They said, why have months of irregular days? Why not make them all the same number of days? Why have weeks of 7 days? Let's make them 10, like our decimal system of measurement, and so on. Now, Hegel saw that as leading to a kind of madly abstract notion of reason, rather like, for instance, the view of a town planner who might look at a map of London and say, oh, well, your streets all run crooked and traffic has to make detours and so on. Let's get rid of this. Let's tear all the buildings down, make nice straight streets. In each block we'll put a big high-rise apartment. We can fit more people in. You can have a smooth green lawn outside for the children to play, and it'll all be beautiful and ordered and rational.
Well, we've actually had that in London, and it's been catastrophic.
That's right. And Hegel would have predicted that it would have been catastrophic because it was abstract reason taken to an extreme. For Hegel, what a rational ordering of London town planning would be to look at the real, that is London as it exists, find what's rational in the real, and of course it has developed the way it did for certain reasons, so there's the rational element, and then try and follow those reasons through in a way that fulfills the rationale behind London's development without trying to raise it down and start anew, to get rid of some of the arbitrary and capricious points perhaps that are particular problems, but basically to find what's rational in what's real and enhance it and develop it and allow it to fulfill itself.
One criticism that's always been brought forward against this conception of the state, the rational state, by liberal philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon tradition especially, is that by seeing the state as an organic whole, which behaves rationally and orders everything rationally, Hegel leaves no room at all for individual dissent, criticism, freedom, one can say, eccentricity. There's no room in the system for the individual to behave as he likes. What's your comment on that?
I don't think there's any evidence that Hegel was opposed to some individual freedoms. But what is true is that his view of freedom was not the standard Anglo-Saxon liberal view of freedom. To look at the difference between the two, let's shift to a somewhat different area, economics and the idea of freedom in the economic sphere, in the market. According to one view, the liberal view, freedom consists simply in people being able to do as they prefer. If I prefer to wear an orange shirt this spring, for instance, then I'm free if I can do that. If I prefer to buy a deodorant, I'm free if I can do that. And that's all that the liberal economist will ask. Are you free to choose the preferences that you have to fulfill them? But some of the more radical economists have questioned that, and they've said that's a very superficial notion of freedom. You should ask, why do you want to wear an orange shirt this season? Why do you want to use a deodorant? Why don't you accept that a certain amount of natural body odor isn't a problem or whatever? And the radical economists will say the reason is that you've been manipulated. There are people who want to make a profit out of you buying their deodorant, out of you thinking that the clothes and the colours you wore last season are no longer good enough this season. So you've been manipulated. You're not free. You have to ask not only can you do what you prefer, but why do you prefer what you prefer? Are they rational preferences? Are they preferences that satisfy your needs? Now, Hegel would have been in the latter camp. He would have said freedom is more than just ability to follow your own caprice. Freedom must consist in fulfilling yourself as a rational individual.
Well, that sounds all very well, but surely what it's going to mean in practice is that I think I know what I want. I want to wear an orange shirt this spring, and I want to go out and buy a deodorant in hot weather, but we have a state, perhaps, which says, no, you think you want those, but those are not rational preferences on your part. We know what's best for you. We know even what you would want if your preferences were rational. In other words, you get a state that not only knows what's good for you better than you do yourself, you actually get a state that knows what you want better than you know yourself. And surely that's authoritarian in the extreme in its relation to the individual.
I think in practice you're probably right, and I don't know that Hegel has any reply to that objection. The only thing that he can say is that while it might be very difficult in practice to work out how you could have a society in which individuals genuinely realize their rational self without an authoritarian state, that doesn't mean that you've overcome the problem by the liberal laissez-faire notion. I mean, we still do have to face that problem, that people's wants and desires might be being manipulated, and to the extent that they are, it's perhaps misleading to say that they're really free.
In other words, it's still a problem,
It's
even
still
if
a problem.
Hegel doesn't necessarily have the right answer to it. Let's just take stock for a moment of where we've got in the discussion. Right at the very beginning, I asked you what you thought was the easiest way in to an understanding of Hegel's philosophy as a whole, and you replied that you thought the best starting point was with the philosophy of history. So we started there, and in fact we've continued our discussion in a straight line, so to speak, to the point that we've now reached. Well, now, are we now in a better position to understand other aspects of Hegel's philosophy than we were?
I think we've already, in fact, grasped some of the essentials of Hegel's logic, for instance, one of its most abstract points, because we've grasped the dialectic, which is part of logic, the idea of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, in the logic, one of the points Hegel makes is that logic is not just a matter of form as separate from content, which is the way the traditional logic of Aristotle was interpreted. He says that form and content are together. And we can see why he says that, because he thinks that this dialectic is something that is realized in the actual process of history. In logic, he says, you study that in the sense of you study truth without its husk, he put it. That is, the eternal immutable form of it, irrespective of a particular historical content. But in fact, it's always linked to that content. So that's one of the key ideas of the logic. And another point that we've also just touched on is this notion of ultimate reality and the way in which it's in some sense a matter of mind rather than a matter of material things.
It seems to me, looking at the exposition of Hegel's ideas that you've put forward up to this point, that there's one central concept out of which almost all the important other ideas naturally arise. The central concept is that understanding reality isn't understanding a given state of affairs, it's understanding a process of perpetual change. The other concepts arise in the following natural order, it seems to me. If one asks oneself, what is it that's changing? Hegel's answer is, it is Geist which is changing, and you've explained what he means by that rather difficult concept, mind, spirit, whatever it may be. If one says, why is it changing? The answer is, because to begin with, it's in a state of alienation, and you've explained that. If one says, what is the process of change? What is the pattern of change? The answer is, it's the dialectical process. If you ask, where is all this change heading? The answer is, well, at the political and social level, it's heading towards an organic society, which we've discussed. At the philosophical level, it's all heading towards absolute knowledge, which you've at least touched on. So in this way, all these central concepts of Geist, alienation, dialectical change, the organic society, all arise out of a consideration of this central idea of reality as a process, as a historical process of change. Now, we've been able to put this very clearly, and the next question I want to ask you is, why didn't Hegel? We said right at the beginning that he's notoriously obscure. Sometimes philosophy students read out passages of Hegel aloud just to make everybody laugh, because it sounds like such gobbledygook. You can read page after page of Hegel sometimes and think, what the hell is he saying? Now, why wasn't he clear when it's possible to be clear about his ideas, as you indeed in your book have shown?
Some of his less charitable critics thought that he was deliberately obscure in order to appear more profound, in order to cover what they took to be the shallowness of his ideas. But I don't think his ideas are shallow. I think they're very deep and profound, and that in fact the difficulty comes from the nature of the ideas. One of his students said that whereas an eloquent lecturer might have had everything off by heart and would arrange it well and trot it out clearly, Hegel was always dredging up difficult ideas as he went along, as he lectured. He was bringing these ideas to the surface with great difficulty. And that's the style. The style is one of someone who's thinking aloud and having difficulty with the material. We may very well regret that he didn't then revise and polish it, but in the context of German philosophical style at the time, it's not so surprising that he didn't feel the need for clarity that you just mentioned, because after all, Kant and Fichte, other contemporaries, were also very obscure, and they were still regarded as great philosophers.